engaging in state warfare. A little bit far-fetched, but something to look at anyway. I'd just also like to thank the team that's participated in developing this session today. And apologies from Chad Briggs, who was originally going to come and co-facilitate with me, but has unfortunately had another commitment come up. The work presents basically fell out of a number of workshops we held 3 years ago, an ongoing dialogue between New Zealand Defence Forces and Australia, but also Chad Briggs from the Global US, and some others which I'll introduce on the next slide. So here are some of the other contributors to the work we're doing. As you see, we strongly believe in the need for transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary dialogue and the connection between science and security forces and other public sector and private sector organisations. And we've been particularly influenced in this regard by the work of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, which some of you may have come across their work, which is a strong advocate not for the securisation of climate change, but for the normalisation of security actors into climate change and climate engineering conversations. And the real logic behind that, and Rear Admiral Neil Morrissey speaks much more powerfully than I can, is that if we're coming to an approaching global emergency, all the actors that can help deal with solutions or contribute to solutions in that space need to be part of the conversation. And that creates some interesting dimensions of trust, particularly between security forces, which are viewed differently from different nations around the world, and science communities, government communities, and civil communities. I mentioned climate change as a lived experience for defence, and I had the privilege to deploy with New Zealand Defence Forces to Tuvalu, which I'm not sure if those are familiar with it. It's one of the most out-of-the-way, tiny nations in the world, which has the highest point at only 5 metres above sea level. And so again, I had a personal experience with what climate change meant, and thus the need to take action. One of the things I personally, and I'm not speaking from an official position, I'm speaking from the group of interested contributors, is that Defence actually has quite a bit to offer to solutions, both to climate change, but also into talking with those that are developing technological solutions that may be feasible. And what it brings to the table, as mentioned by some of the earlier speakers, is a capacity for strategic planning. Defence characteristically looks 10, 25, 50 or even 100 years forward. So dealing with dimensions of choice over long periods of time and dealing with intertemporal choice where you have risks now for benefits later or benefits now for risk later is quite a normal part of our planning process. We also have substantial research and intelligence and modelling capabilities that can, in collaboration with other science, both in private sector and academic sectors, contribute towards better understanding the implications of climate engineering. It also has, one of the things that is become a hot topic in Australia is the logistics capacity to implement some of the large-scale responses to climate change, including climate engineering. There's a call from some of our activist groups for the world to be put onto a war economies. If you're looking at this as the critical decade, we're halfway through. The action at the moment is not progressing fast enough to avoid some of the climate engineering solutions, or it needs to have some climate engineering solutions as part of a package or suite of actions. And to sort of mobilise economies globally to take those actions requires, in some thinking, something like we saw in World War II, where we saw mass transformations of economies, in that instance to support war efforts. The theory is that if economies can transform that rapidly to support war efforts and change the entire production, something like that needs to be applied in the renewable energy sector and manufacturing sectors to make the necessary changes. So again, there's quite a lot of capacity in defence forces, and I must admit these guys aren't calling for a defence-led, they're calling for a Ministry of Mobilisation. But again, defence forces have capacity in logistics planning and logistics to support such activities. And the final thing, and I just like to make this distinction between science and intelligence, where I spent most of my background in intelligence, but working certainly in the last 10 years a lot with the science community, is the different approach to decision making under uncertainty. And I guess characterising the intelligence world, the right information a day late is the wrong information, because the decision has to be made at the time in order to deal with the circumstances on the ground. So there is a fundamental decision heuristics on the balance of probability, not beyond reasonable doubt. And so if you're dealing in conversations with defence communities, their approach to the probability of truth or the accuracy of science is quite different. They will just balance the risk as they see it with the information they have to hand. And some of the things like precautionary principle and waiting till the evidence is in is actually quite an alien concept for defence decision making. So something to keep at your back of your mind. It's a fundamental different heuristics. I always have arguments with our scientists. They produce brilliant stuff 2 months after a decision has been made. It's just not the way we do business. Moving on, I provided some focus questions for this session. I want to talk a little bit about what a weapon is. I brought some weapons in today to demonstrate. Most of you probably traditionally thinking weapons are sort of knives and guns and tanks and planes and bombs and stuff. But actually in modern warfare, which is moved into what we call information age warfare, weapons are often quite different things. You know, the definition in US weaponeering is sort of anything, any system that can assist a commander achieve an effect that supports the commander's mission. So here's a weapon. Anyone disagree that that's a weapon?
You could throw it at somebody.
I could throw it at someone. But also if I was really, really sophisticated on a computer system, which I'm not, I could use that to sort of take action in cyberspace. And one of the conversations, I think was a session later today, which was looking at the cyberspace or space dimension. And again, in the interconnected world, all these things are coming together now, because often the command and control mechanisms of a number of major sort of engineering, energy sectors, transport sectors are controlled largely through automated systems which can be interdicted by these. And the price of access of that is now not in the hands of defence forces and states. The price of access to these systems is in the hands of any citizens with capacity. I brought another weapon in as well. I'm allowed to light this. I hopefully won't set off the phone. So now I ask you, firstly, is this a weapon, but also is this a weapon of mass destruction? That's where I come from in Australia. One of the biggest sort of hazards or threats to the nation is now fire. They're very vulnerable to fire and drought. And again, the access cost of this is about the cheapest thing you can buy in Europe, 10 cents. I had to pay 10 cents for weapons since I was about 14, so that was quite fun. So really pretty much anything can be weaponised, and weapons come in different shapes and forms. And one of the things looking at climate engineering technology, we've had some discussions about what are the regulatory frameworks. And just thinking also, should they be considered weapons of mass destruction? They're not chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear, which is the current suite. But potentially they have the same mass effects, and mass destructive effects, and mass effects on the Earth system. So is that another regulatory framework we should be looking at? And then there are the framework of the laws of armed conflict, where decision making about proportionality come into place. So is that another useful framework coming out of the security dimension, which could be applied to climate engineering? The second thing, of course, not all weapons can be weaponised. And while militaries have been using fire for 2,000 years, it's a classic strategy certainly in Chinese military thinking. The ability to apply these types of tools with precision is only just coming in with the climate engineering technologies. So our militaries have previously been interested in some of the technologies that have been able to be applied with precision, which is one of the things in a weaponeering process. You need to be able to say, this is a target, I can fix that weapon on that target, and it's not going to go off beam and affect other things. I need to make decisions about proportionality. So if I apply this weapon here, and there is collateral damage somewhere else, that may be inappropriate in the use of a weapon system. I also need to be able to assess the impacts of that weapon. So if I'm applying a weapon onto a target, I can't then say has it impacted it or not. I can't draw a direct cause from, hey, I put the weapon on that target, it created the effect I wanted or some other effect. Then it's very difficult to put it into a weaponeering process. So there's a difference between weapons and weaponeering. Without further ado, I think I'm now going to move to the scenario process. So what I'm going to do is present scenarios. I have to be careful here. Scenarios in a modelling sense are different from scenarios in a defence planning sense. Ours are not predictions or extrapolations or creations from stochastic or dynamic modelling. They're merely a space to explore a set of decisions and a set of potential actions, and also look at how we got here and how we might not want to get here. I also want to focus when I go through these at some things that haven't come up a lot in the discussion so far. One is about timeframes. I think timeframes is critical to the debate about climate engineering. The other is tipping points. Not just scientific tipping points or climate tipping points, but social tipping points and political tipping points. And finally, again came up in the first day, the concept of desperation in decision making under a sense of desperation. Obviously, if people reach a certain point where there appears to be no other option, that's the point at which climate engineering may be applied, even inappropriately. And so the degree of desperation is, I think, critical to the understanding of the climate engineering debate. So the way I'm going to run this session is I'm going to invite participation from the audience. So hopefully not too shy. This works very well with military audience because I can tell people to come to the front. So we're going to try this on a larger science audience for the first time, so bear with me. So I want to try to get volunteers representing from different domains amongst the audience to come and join me up the front. So you get to be in what's called a fishbowl, which is the fishbowl there. So I'm looking firstly for a volunteer from the science community. Is there anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to have to run this session with me standing up the front and putting questions to you sitting there. It'd be much easier if you can come up the front because then you can have the microphone and the discussion. Yep, got one volunteer there. Another volunteer, I'm going to target Arkham with this session, who comes from looking at the security dimension of the problem. So Arkham, if you'd like to come up and take a seat at the front. Anyone from a legal background? Now, if you miss out this time, there are a number of scenarios, so you get a chance to all come up the front. Or not, as the case might be. If you're really desperate to come up and have a say, please come in and take one of the seats down here, which I've got reserved. Anyone from sort of civic community action background? Anyone from social science or ethics? Come up. Cool. I'll zap my weapon. Anyone who's just desperate to come up and have a conversation? I've run out of anyone missing. So anyone from a different domain or different background, arts or anything else, would like to come up and say your voice is missing so that we're in a conversation.
Just an environmental activist.
Environmental activist, excellent.
Yeah, just sit there, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Couple of environmental activists.
Yeah.
Okay, each of these scenarios is just very, very simplistic. So they're not going to follow these dramatic, they're not models of the future, these are just spaces where we can have a discussion. So the first scenario vignette, which is one that came up out of yesterday's panel with Arkham and Jurgen, which is basically a point comes where a unilateral action is taken by a country. I have to call country, because there's only really two countries that can fit this bill. I didn't want to be seen as biased as any one of them. So in this case, we have a country that's got to a state where it believes in the interest of protecting its peoples, it needs to take unilateral action on climate change. And that action includes both mitigation and adaptation, but also some dimensions of climate engineering. The first question I'm going to ask is, who thinks that this will happen by 2100? And I ask you to put your hands up. So who thinks this is a plausible scenario in that time frame? You put your hands up, audiences, panel as well. So actually that's roughly about half, I think, perhaps some of you being shy. Who thinks this might happen in the next 25 years? Okay, a couple think this might happen in the next 25. I probably would join that as well. And so this is really, I guess, something that may be far off, maybe it'll be close, and again, the science being uncertain about the tipping points. I'm never quite sure, but it's useful to plan in advance being military. We certainly think out to 2100. Now I guess the next thing, think how desperate would someone have to be to start unilateral action? And that's the first question I'm going to throw to the panel is, from your perspective, and again the tipping point may be social, tipping point may be political, tipping point may be scientific, tipping point may be economic, but what do you think is going to drive, from your various backgrounds, a country to take this action? So you've got the microphones in front of you, guys. Pick up the microphones, and you have to talk right into the microphones.
Which way to turn it on?
Into insert. So over.
I can't imagine any country doing this and risking being attacked by other countries, because it would right away be considered an attack on other countries. It would be changing their climate in ways that might not be desirable. So I can't imagine people taking that risk. It would make much more sense to convince them to stop putting greenhouse gases in than to do something like this. It would depend, of course, how much you put in and where you put it and for how long. But there's already issues like this in terms of weather modification. When somebody tries to make rain, it's stealing rain from people downwind. Well, it might not work very well, but people can perceive it as that.
Is there any other views? Can someone see a country doing this?
Yes. Well, when you look at the United Nations 42 countries, a list of 42 countries that are engaging in full-time weather modification programs, and you look at owning the weather by 2025 US military document, I see all this happening already with my own eyes. I don't have to foresee it happening in the future, so I don't have to speculate. I already know what's going on because it's already been confirmed by United Nations. US military planning on owning the weather within another 10 years. They're not just going to do this within 10 years. They've already been doing it since, well in development since World War II. Weather as a weapon, as the document is entitled, weather as a force multiplier. So I don't need to look at the future, it's happening now. Weather modification is a massive, massive business, not only for weather enhancement, but for also corporate profit. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, weather derivatives, weather as a business is huge business for insurance purposes, for gambling on the stock exchange. Billions are made every day on weather. Let's see.
We might hold it there and throw it over to, we
Okay.
had some other views from the panel. You thought we would be doing this in 100 years. What situation do you think might tip a country to do this? So it wouldn't be something that did lightly, I'd agree, but a country taking this type of action is exposing itself to international condemnation, to the mechanisms of international security. But it might take a risk if it's a big country. The question might be that a small country may not want to do this, but would a big country that feels itself, if you like, secure from attack, and with a population that is calling out for this type of action to be taken because people are suffering, and it's like the populace is starving and there's local conflict. It might take this. So is there a different view?
Well, I think it's by the end of the century, unilateral action would really be stronger, and especially with information technology, I think the exchange of communication in terms of taking action about the situation would be more effective. And well, you're right in terms of it will be unilateral action will depend on how much the capacity of a country is. In terms of resources, small countries might not have the resources to take unilateral action, but in terms of activating, for example, support from the diaspora, putting pressure more on the other governments there, I think, I think multilateral action on this would be more viable.
From the legal perspective?
Well, I'm not sure necessarily from a legal perspective particularly, but I suppose one option to perhaps counter Alan's remarks, you suggested that it would be more sensible for a state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I suppose if you have a relatively small state which doesn't have large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions but potentially is going to be affected by climate change, and they may not have the technology, then I could see then maybe there might be a sort of an impetus to take alternative mechanisms, bearing in mind that sort of the reduction of greenhouse gases requires a concerted effort, so if that's not an option.
I have a question about your scenario. When you say high altitude, how high? Do you mean, the question is it the stratosphere or is it the upper troposphere?
The stratosphere.
The stratosphere.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, what do you mean by re-inject? You mean inject?
But basically it's taking sulfates out of its industrial systems and using those sulfates to be injected into the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, sulfur is easy to get. You don't need to scrub it out of a coal stack. But
don't worry about the detail, Alan.
No, but
it's called don't fight the white.
No, my point is that it wouldn't have a local effect. If you put it in the stratosphere, it may or may not have a global effect. And locally, it might, if you're having drought, it might actually exacerbate the drought. So you couldn't be sure, trying to change the global climate, that it would really even be a benefit to your country.
Sorry, from the audience. So have some microphones for the audience as well.
That's a rational response, Alan, but it's not necessarily the way people think. If it were a rational response, we wouldn't have 42 countries doing cloud seeding, because the rational answer is we can't show that it happened. So somebody could decide, we can't show that it works.
Yeah.
So the rational response would be, well, it might not work, but there's going to be people who are going to say, look, this is what's going to happen. Sure enough, we're going to try it out. So I don't see the rational response to the stop it.
Yeah, and there's a question there is what if the population is asking its government to take this action? So I think the comment there.
As far as weather modification is concerned, international governments were so concerned following the Vietnam War that they developed the Enmod Treaty in 1977, because Project Popeye was effective. According to the pilots flying the 2,000 plus sorties from their 6 aircraft, they said it was very effective, pilots themselves in interviews. But previously to that, in 1952, in Lynmouth in the UK, there was an RAF mission that was known as Operation Cumulus, which is the crew, the flight crew is called Operation Witch Doctor, when they were interviewed and recorded from, when they were recording their logbooks of the actual mission. And this mission was successful in creating a massive storm that killed 35 people, but the RAF and the UK government and the UK Met Office who were involved have denied this, except there's enough investigation now and the flight crew of those particular flights themselves confessing and talking about this, so we know that it's quite effective for quite a long time. And I must admit that for a nation to be, anyone to say weather modification doesn't work, it's been actively pursued by over 100 nations for 70 years. So this is a very widespread
pursued, and it would be naive to think that it would have no effect on climate, or played down, purposely perhaps. And I think also, if we looked at technologies which are we know of in the public domain, such as the use of ionospheric heaters, such as HARP, and there are many different types of ionospheric heaters around the planet, whose in 1998, the European Parliament was requesting information about HARP because they were concerned it would affect the climate.
Well, you know, you're just wrong. To tell whether weather modification works, you need data, you need observations. A pilot can't tell flying through a cloud whether he's causing rain at the ground. At the American Meteorological Society meeting in Seattle several years ago, there was a session on weather as a weapon, and there was a U.S. Air Force general there, and I asked him, did it work? Did this cloud seeding over Vietnam work? And he said, well, none of our skies had rain gauges, and so we don't know. We just did it because we hoped it would work. Precipitation is so variable and so stochastic that you need long time series, and you need to know what would have happened if you hadn't seeded. And Tom's right there. The evidence that cloud seeding works is very minimal. But you said, why would we do it if it didn't work? Well, the answer, obviously, is you do it because you make money doing it, because somebody pays you to do it, and you fool people into thinking that it is working. And so a politician will say, well, I can do it or not, and if I don't do it, people will criticize me for not trying, so I might as well try, and then I'll, and my buddy's going to make some money doing this. That's why it's done. There's no evidence that it works.
Well, I guess just before we go back, we said that this is most likely to happen sort of 50 years in the future. Just ask with a number of perhaps the science community, in 50 years in the future, do we see us having the information about these technologies to be able to employ them with confidence? And if so, what's preventing us from achieving that? So, would anyone like to comment on that? Joseph, the one at the back there.
Thank you. Before I reply to your question, I want to tell Alan Roebuck, you cannot be for certain that what you are saying is true. Because in history we know that Napoleon wanted to invade UK. And why did he fail? It was simply because of the storm that swept away all the ships. If human beings are able to trigger a storm, they may use weather as a weapon. Let me tell you something very simple. Our traditional society were using witchcraft to cause rains, and they do it up to now. We cannot say that no, it will not happen, it's not possible. Probably it's your perception of things. But actually, apart from science, there is non-scientific ways of knowledge, and we accept that in science, that people can use to trigger a natural phenomenon that can happen. So about the technology, I think it's already there, but probably they're trying to refine so that it can fit to certain purpose. That's what I think.
Is there a different view?
Well, you asked a really lovely question that's worth a couple of lectures about the technology and what we need.
So mic on?
In very simple.
You have to hold the microphone.
Yeah, in very simple. I think that in order to have this technology, you're going to have very high resolution models, which requires a lot of computer power. We already have a lot of computer power, but we're on a trajectory for more. So I think that's going to be one of the big factors, is the ability to simulate this at a high level. The other thing on the technology side is you have to have some way of providing enough energy into the system. And the way we're seeding right now does not provide enough energy into the system to provide really good way of modifying very strong systems. I don't actually see what that technology would be. So the predictive side, I think, yeah, I see how to do that. The technology side of actually doing the seeding, I don't.
Okay. I might now ask about came up earlier about the security aspect of this. I think in our first response is what mechanisms. Say this is a large country, and pick the USA or China who decide that this is an action they're going to take unilaterally. Both of those countries, between them, are sort of substantial component of the world's military power. So what mechanisms does the United Nations or other countries have from a security perspective to actually stop those countries taking this action? I might throw to Arkin in the world geopolitics and world politics. Does he see the international security mechanism as being able to actually intervene if a major power takes this action?
Well, there's a whole lot of activities which could be think about depending on how this technology is implemented. For example, does it require any specific, actually, whatever minerals, rare earth metals, for example, is there a possibility to increase the prices, for example, for this specific metal, so the country may become more expensive to afford that? What is the control mechanism? Is it, for example, all unmanned aerial vehicles, and what possibilities would there exist for a cyber attack? What would be possibilities for economic sanctions? How could you create, for example, a public relations negative campaign, perhaps on Facebook and stuff like that? Could you, for example, create memes of going viral actually that within the country this is actually even being bad or something? So there's a whole lot of activities below, as you just mentioned, for example, with your iPhone, of actually using any sort of force which could be done. And of course there are other possibilities if you go around and just say, for example, ostracizing this country in international fora, like for example, a trade organization or other actually areas so on. If you want to go down that, I would suspect actually that even before this activity starts, there would be a lot of concern by a number of, not only one major nation, just saying, asking what they are doing there, talking to ambassadors and so on, stuff like that. So I think it would, I find it implausible, or let's say very unlikely, that just a country is being completely autistic about that issue, maybe.
I'd just like to make a comment. I see the world very differently than you do. You're from the defense community. I'm from the science community. When I think of science, I think of cooperation with China. The world science community works together to try and solve problems. We're right now collaborating with Chinese scientists to study geoengineering, to do the same climate model simulations to try and understand what the climate response would be. And so I see the future, and I see the U.S. and China, for example, so closely interwoven in our business relationships, in our economical relationships, that it wouldn't make any sense at all to try and start a conflict between the countries. It would hurt both countries, and I just can't imagine one country taking a unilateral action to try and cause the climate to change or the world that they know would affect the other country. My vision of the future is countries working together to study the environmental problems and working to solve them together rather than to do it in a hostile way.
And I'd just like to add that the militaries are not quite as different from the science community as you might think. We actually do a lot of collaboration among military nations, and in the Asia Pacific region there's a regional environmental security forum that looks at how militaries can work together and focused at the moment on response to disasters, because disasters are exceeding the capacities of individual militaries, and also in the Caribbean countries they actually cooperate and have a disaster relief force that is contributed to by all the countries to respond to that circumstance. There's probably a good time now to move to the second vignette.
Cheryl, can I just quickly comment to Alan, please?
A quick comment on that.
Yeah, the thing is that the same exists with the European Union and Russia, actually, being many European countries solely dependent actually on, for example, gas supplies and oil supplies from Russia, very intensive economic relations, and even us in our institute actually now that the situation becomes more tense, and the question, can we continue our scientific cooperation with our Russian counterparts, because are they scientists allowed to come to us, can we actually visa to go to that country? And of course Ukraine is a very different example than I would say is this situation actually, but even though after more or less 10 years, 15 years of more intensifying scientific, cultural, economic and so on relationships, we are now in a situation where it is quite imaginable by many people that this is now turning back actually. So while I would agree that the intensification of relationships between US and China and other areas exists, I can imagine situations that is just backtracking actually, so I would not rule it out completely.
Clive.
I agree with Alan that the relationships between the United States and China are likely to deepen, although we've seen China play a lot of brinkmanship over, apparently irrelevant islands where they're willing to, ramp it up quite a lot. But I think that cooperation, that relationship is likely to lead to a bilateral action between China and the US. For my money, in an emergency where there's extreme pressure on populations in the US and China, I think that the most likely scenario, so far as we can see anything from here, is China taking action or preserve the Chinese Communist Party in power in the face of widespread social unrest due to famines and droughts and heat waves and so on. And with the US going along with it, perhaps because of domestic opposition in the United States, the power of environment groups and citizen anxiety and so on, the US might not formally, openly endorse China spraying sulphate aerosols, but may formally say we don't approve this, but give a nudge and a wink and say, well, we're not going to shoot down your planes.
I guess that's an interesting point. If China and US were to take bilateral action, again, we had some options for sort of activism below conflict options toward those two countries, but I certainly can't see a conflict option. I can't see any rest of the world having the military capacity or force capacity to take action against the US, China working together.
Certainly not the EU.
Certainly not the EU, but also, I can be at ease.
Well, the EU has nuclear weapons. Would they? That makes the world very dangerous.
It does, and we're now getting almost into clone engineering, potentially in a similar type of place as mutually assured destruction. So, question to you, Tom. You, the EU, are you going to press your nuclear weapon on that?
Oh no, I think we have to get rid of nuclear weapons so we have the luxury of worrying about global warming. The world's much too dangerous with them, and you can't use them. But that's a whole other topic.
Yeah,
Can I ask if we've had I believe we've had 2,050 nuclear detonations since the Second World War. Is there any possibility that those various different nuclear detonations, some of them in the upper atmosphere, some of them in the Arctic, 130 I believe, and more in the Antarctic and all around the planet, is it possible that those nuclear detonations should be included in the weather models for the effects on climate?
I'm not sure you're right about detonations in the Antarctic, but the way that the tests of nuclear weapons that have been done in the atmosphere so far have been on islands in the atmosphere away from places where there would be anything to burn. The way that nuclear weapons affect climate is by targeting cities or industrial areas that produce lots of smoke, and it's the smoke from the fires that blocks out the sun and causes cooling. So the original paper Tom Ackerman was an author of showed about nuclear winter that if there's enough smoke, it will cool the planet, and our recent work shows the effects would last for decades. And so, but the weapons have to be dropped on places that burn, and we go into a building and say 1 square meter, okay, how much material is here that burns? This is wood burns with a lighter smoke, the plastic burns with a black city smoke, and you could do calculations of how much smoke there is and then how much would stay in the atmosphere. And that's what I'm concerned about. Even a small number of such fires could cause global climate change. And most people don't realize that and think they're just like bigger bombs. But we've been really lucky in 69 years that they haven't been used on humans again. So I'm concerned about that. So, but the tests that have been done didn't produce large amounts of smoke. Now there was firebombing in World War II, cities in Germany, cities in Japan, and each of those, whether it was with a nuclear bomb or with so-called conventional weapons, and that smoke probably did have a climate effect, but there was only one here and one there, and so totally it wasn't that large of an effect. We don't have very good data, but I've looked into it a little bit. The global climate was about 1/10 of a degree colder for the 5 years after World War II. I don't know how much of that might have been a climate effect, but it's so variable, it's probably not a good statistic.
Okay, I might move on there to the utopian future. So I'm actually an optimist by nature, so I hope this is the one we're moving to. Can I ask I have some different volunteers from the audience to come up, those who perhaps are more optimistic, who might want to talk to the security implications and the security dimensions of this particular future. So any other volunteers?
You want us to come down?
No, you have them there.
It's actually like the Flying Dutchman. We can't leave the ship until we find a replacement. So,
Exactly.
so surely someone who, so it's a shy audience. No, almost? Okay, I might release this audience anyway, so just ask questions from the floor. So I think give them a round of applause. So I guess we had a sense that another scenario wasn't terribly likely, although it might have, was more perhaps likely to bilateral might be taken. This is a scenario where the world gets its shit in one sock, so to speak, and takes action in time to coordinate global action on climate change, including some uses of climate engineering. Governments are required to move to a wartime footing. I guess I ask the same question. Who thinks this is likely in the next 100 years? Okay, so roughly about a third of the same, so a third of the people say. Now, if it was a different form of global governance other than the UN, who thinks this is more likely? So is something other than the current UN series of current UN mechanism needed? So if we move to a different model of global governance, would there be more likely for action? So who think that would be more likely?
With respect that we move to a different model of governance, or that a different model of governance will achieve this?
A different model of governance, okay, phrase that question precisely. That a different model of global governance is more likely than the current model to achieve this. So who thinks that's now more likely? Doesn't mean it's more. So question, what actions are we taking to try and change global governance? Because if we think that the changing global governance is necessary to catalyse global action, this is one of the things that we need to develop along with technologies, because if we have the technologies but we don't have the global will to act.
Could the military help us on that?
Is that the type of global governance I was thinking about? No. I see ourselves more as a Star Trek than Star Wars. Who thinks this is likely within, so we think, very few people think this is likely for the next 100 years, so who think this is likely within the critical decade, the next 5 years? Okay, what prompts you Tom, to make that,
Alan.
Sorry, to make that call?
I wouldn't actually include the climate engineering measures in it. I would include aggressive carbon emission. There are tipping points in human behavior, not just in the climate system. Just look at Germany where we sit now. Look at the massive change that they've made in their energy structure, from burning dirty brown coal to becoming one of the greenest countries with subsidies, so that there's a massive solar and wind energy. And that just shows an example of how the world could react. In the United States, the state with the largest amount of wind power is Texas. So that's where the wind is. And so I see the price of solar plummeting. I see people figuring out how to hook up the electrical grids, and it's going to be an economic decision, but I think there are going to be people realizing how dangerous climate change is, and sort of flipping in terms of their opposition to mitigation, to understanding that that's the only path forward. Maybe I'm very optimistic, but that's how I see things happening quickly.
And Max, I think you also were optimistic. What was the reasons for the optimism?
Well, I see that we're moving towards the Sustainable Development Agenda, where there will be a globalised government system, and all 192 nations have signed up to Agenda 21. And I see this being the framework that will be used to get the global acceptance in order to be able to implement or deploy climate engineering.
Okay, thank you. Now, some people, most of you are less optimistic, so can we hear from someone who holds the opposite view that we won't actually get to global collaboration on dealing with climate change in the first instance and climate engineering in the second instance?
I'm definitely not optimistic because I've been involved in the UNFCCC negotiations since the beginning for over 30 years now. And to me, it's very much competition over collaboration. When it comes down to the wire, it's national interest in what is best for the countries. A classic example is the way the geopolitical makeup within the UNFCCC context. You've got G77 in China and then Annex 1, OECD countries. When you talk G77 in China, that's way back when the UN was set up, early, just solely for implementing the Marshall Plan, after the World War. Things have changed so rapidly, and yet the structure within the UN hasn't changed. So it's still called G77 in China, but it's more than 100 developing countries involved now. But most of those countries that are not prepared to change the current structure because it suits. You can be playing a developing country, but also a developed country perspective. And you have those South-South cooperation, North-South cooperation. And the number of studies and papers been called for global restructuring of the UN system. It's very difficult to get that agreement internationally. That's my view.
Any other views from those that are less optimistic?
It's not really a view, but a question for people who don't think about climate issues all the time, as their regular job, but who think about broader issues. Is it likely that the global community would rally around this issue when there are so many other pressing things on people's minds, global terrorism questions, military issues, other security problems, food issues? Is this going to rise to are people going to rise to this challenge that people who worry about climate change think of as a huge challenge, but is that a common thing among nations?
I think that's a very valuable question because obviously for societies to demand action of governments and governments then to demand action of multinational bodies, there has to be this focus of societies on this issue. And certainly from where I come, Australia, there's not a focus of society on this issue. There are advocates who are saying that this is what needs to be happening, but they're not the dominant
Australia, certainly the population feels you've had such extreme weather in the past several decades that that's not the case in Australia.
And that's perhaps a question I'll throw to the audience. So is there in the EU, for example, a strong consensus for action on responding to climate change? Is there anywhere, apart from some of the Pacific Island and states such as the Maldives that are strongly have a social consensus, a social contract driving the need for governments to act on climate change? Has anyone got an experience, Clive?
Well, I think the Australian experience is instructive because, as you remember, we had a really devastating drought that lasted 10 years. And so in 2007, both major political parties, Labor and Liberal, that is Conservative, went into the election promising to introduce an emissions trading system. Even John Howard had expressed doubts about climate science for some years. And that reflected the anxiety in the Australian electorate about climate change. The problem, of course, is that a bit later it started to rain. And as a result of that, it became possible, along with other factors, for the Conservatives to move away from their commitment to tackling climate change. And so the sad truth, I think, is that in countries like Australia, at least in the United States, that kind of political consensus requires a sustained series or long period of environmental disaster. But not only that, also environmental climate-related disasters that are in the public mind related to human-induced climate change. This is another question.
So I guess following on from that, sure, one more comment.
In the UK and in 66 other nations around the world, I believe Australia had a problem agreeing to this, but they have signed up to 500 new climate change laws which come into play in 2015. They were signed in 2013. So clearly there is already the framework being put into place in order to address this with the population, because the laws obviously will affect the population. Also, the United Nations have a new agenda called the United Nations Post-2015 Agenda, and this has been signed by many different leaders. And the first part of this is to deal with climate change. So there are definitely plans being taken up, but I don't think many of the public realise this.
Okay, so just following on with the need for public communication, just a question again to the science community. The science community, again, I congratulate the conveners on the approach of this conference, which is to bring a much broader church together to have these discussions. Is the science community doing enough, or can it do more, or what should it do in order to get the logical arguments? When you look at the data and you don't believe in climate change, there's a quote in one of the Australian publications, well, you don't understand data. So is there a communication problem for the science community about how it characterises its information, or is it more a disinformation from vested interests? So any comments on that one? One there and then one at the back.
I'm trying not to react badly to that question. This has become the mantra the last few years, is that it's the fault of the science, particularly in the United States, that it's the fault of the science community for not adequately communicating with the public. And so there's been enormous pressure put on the science community to have public outreach in their proposals, and I could go on and on. I have nothing against public outreach. I do it all the time. But one of my analogies is to say, if I went out and talked to 100 people every night of the year, by the end of the year I would have talked to 365,000 people. Rush Limbaugh gets to talk to that many in an afternoon, more than that. So it's about platform, it's about communication, it's also about the fact that scientists speak generally in measured language. We believe in probabilities, not in absolute truth, and so we don't do well with sound bites. My daughter says, Dad, I just want the answer, I don't want the lecture. We're good at lectures because we understand nuance. So it is a communication problem, but we have to figure out how to get beyond the idea, and I have this all the time with my students when they come into the class, that scientists are not part of a postmodern generation. We don't actually think that everybody's opinion is equally valid. We think that there are data, and we think that there are facts. Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said on the floor of the Senate, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. So I'm sympathetic to the communication, but it's not the answer to say scientists ought to be better at communicating and then the whole world would work right.
Yeah, sorry, it wasn't intended as a dig against science.
I thought I was trying to have much fun.
No, fair enough. In fact, that's
just
just a personal insight on that one from a real military perspective in Australia is we're running in our Defence Department a range of global awareness seminars on climate change among other issues, and some of the commentary, and we had some open source material, was what the military believed that it must be true. So is there a need for other actors, and again, who is trusted in societies with this communication? And again, different societies have different trusts with different public bodies. Is there a need for those public bodies that are trusted in society to lean forward on this issue? I'm sorry, there's one at the back as well after this one.
Thank you. I totally agree with my brother there. What he's saying is true, and it's the intrinsic nature of science. We don't believe the same thing in science. We can be from the same discipline, but from different schools. modeling is a simple representation to the reality, but it's not the reality. You can tell me that the world will be warming by 4 degrees Celsius in 2100. But is it true? Nobody knows. What kind of parameter do you use in your model? I don't know how you ran your data. I don't know what kind of variable you excluded from your model, which may be more significant than the one you used. So it's up to me to trust you or not. If some people are saying there's not climate change, I will say they are right also. Because their own modeling, they can also prove to you that what we are saying is true. And they can even question your records. Where did you get those records? Most of these models are using paleoclimatic data. But are they really true data? Or they are cooked data? So you see, these are things that are intrinsic to science. And you cannot come and then say, this is what will be happening. And this is what we have to do. You see, this is probably what may happen, or might even happen. And this is what may take as precaution so that we cannot face a catastrophe. So it's intrinsic to science, and me, I agree with both sides. Those who agree, who predict a kind of catastrophe, and those who say there will be nothing.
Yeah, that's really, I understand what you're saying, and I'm not asking you to trust me. What I'm doing is I'm saying there's a scientific consensus, there is a scientific community, and we have a way of going about our business. And to argue that somebody who says, and this is what's going on in the United States right now with climate change, we have somebody who says, well, I don't care what all the climate scientists think because it's not going to happen. All right, that's no basis for having a discussion. That's no basis for having, that's not factual. You can argue about predictions, and I'd be certainly happy to argue with you about whose predictions I would think are right or wrong, and how much faith we should have in them. But we should be able to agree on what we put in the model, and if I put this in the model, this is the result. Not whether that's going to happen in 100 years necessarily. So there are ways of parsing the questions that you raised. This whole issue in the United States about expertise, about experts, and whether we have expert communities. There was a time in the 1950s and 60s when scientists were seen as the authority. All right, that's no longer true. And in fact, I think it's really hard in the United States right now to point to any group that speaks with authority. And I would say there is a loss of this sense of experts and expert judgment. I don't know who you go to.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, because the pattern of communication has changed dramatically in the last 50 years from a single authoritative figure speaking to a mass audience to very differentiated audiences with very differentiated views. So there were some people nodding about the need to sort of go to different communicators. Would anyone like to make a further comment on that about if we're going to get action, who do we need to have voices in the communication space?
I think my main comment would be that more information is not the way to get to a change in decision making. It's a trust issue. It's a matter of, as I guess Clyde raised, if you're from a different political party and you believe something, then you'll search for information that actually confirms what you already believe, what your constituency believes, what's important to them, how do they identify with what's around in their local environment. So more information isn't always the way to get there. Economists can draw two lines on a graph, and there's a red one and a blue one, and they say, well, this is the right answer. Well, scientists don't do that for a reason, because that's not how we communicate, it's not how we get to a solution. So I don't think that necessarily a utopian future is such a simple prospect. It's not a matter of, well, scientists do your job and politicians do your job and international relations do your job and all the rest of it. There's got to be something more, whether it's, as Clive said, environmental disaster that lasts for a long time and triggers what you refer to as a social tipping point or something else. We have enough information, and we may deal with uncertainty in different ways. So the military says, the information the next day is not useful. We may all deal with uncertainty in different ways, but decision makers know how to deal with uncertainty in their ways. and we've dealt with uncertainty, greater uncertainty than this, and come to a decision in the past. There needs to be some other trigger. Thank you. Okay.
Just one quick comment perhaps on the communicators. As you said that if you say the military says that it must be true and so on, I mean, you've just pointed out, I think, at categories like the scientists, the military and so on. Now, for example, the United Kingdom promoted but designated Rear Admiral Neil Morissetti as Special Envoy on Climate and Energy Security, I think it was. Having a high-ranking military officer in Germany appointed to such a position is, in my view, and perhaps my fellow country people could disagree with me, is totally unthinkable. Making an admiral responsible as climate ambassador, nobody would even come to that idea actually, and putting Rear Admiral Neil Morissetti, and that was taken up with high reservations in different areas actually here in Germany and so on. And if you would so go around, and I know from other countries as well actually, if you say the military is now taking charge of it, people are getting more, let's say, reserved and just say there's something wrong here about it, what's going on here actually. And so the other way around, so I think the difficulties here is that also this cultural perspective on different types of actors like scientists, military, church and so on should be taken into account. And I think it is perhaps not impossible, but perhaps not very plausible that you come to the point where all these different categories of actors from all different cultural and national perspectives would come to the same conclusion and opinion in this regard.
Yes, I think it's a very good point. I had one convert saying we believe in the military, but there may well be 3 people that turned away from that debate because of the cultural perceptions of militaries. So one at the back there, sorry, and then one in the corner there.
Yeah, just to comment in relation to our work in science, you know, in the meteorological community, we have a saying that there's no political boundaries when it comes to our work. It's about international collaboration because what data we collected back in the Southern Hemisphere needed for running the model in the Northern Hemisphere and so forth. So even though we have different political setup, we still have to collaborate. So like, I'm pretty sure Cuba will provide the data to the US when there's a hurricane building up. There's no way that the 2 meteorological services will not exchange the data. And that's why we had international free exchange of data set up within the WMO system to allow that. And also in terms of responding to his comments, that's why we have international standards that we have to abide to as a scientist, setting, you know, like for example, in the climate area, you have to set baselines. Otherwise, you're trying to set up your own baseline everywhere, and you'll not be able to come up with the international standard that really drives everything. So that's my comment on that one. In terms of the communication, you have to frame your message bearing in mind cultural, political, and the country you're dealing with or the community you're dealing with. It's very different talking to somebody in Tuvalu, for example, than somebody sitting in Wellington. It's completely 2 different perspectives, and you have to understand that differences in order to be able to send the message clearly. And I think that's where we're always been accused of not communicating properly, because in the beginning of the IPCC work, it was very much top-down. You know, you're running a support model, but a lot of people on the ground, they don't care about what's going on somewhere else. What they're interested in is what's going to knock my house down. Tell me about that. Don't worry about what's happening in the El Nino or La Nina conditions.
I'd just like to share, because I work for the Foreign Commonwealth Office of the UK, and Rear Admiral Morissetti is the Climate and Energy Envoy. He was succeeded by Sir David King last year. And Sir David King is also a scientific person, or has a very strong scientific background. He provided advice to the FCO's climate diplomacy policies. And I think, you know, FCO has been really proactive in bringing the climate discussion in the UN UNSG and I think there hasn't been much response to this kind of introduction that the climate change is a security issue at the moment. Although, to my understanding, there is still some appetite or interest about this, but there has been some sort of consensus that climate change falls more on the UNFCCC discussion, and UNSG is a different matter. But I think there will be a continuous engagement to bring this forward to the security level.
It's not a matter about better communication of science. I think we have actually fantastic communication of science in many states. The issue is much more about values. I think scientists with a whole range of other actors need to be engaged in that conversation. I think there's enough information about what we've got to do, but there's obviously a great reluctance about taking that action, and that's because we're wedded to certain values. Our values have changed, over the last few centuries, so it is possible to change from quite different sort of consumptions and perceptions. So, slavery was regarded as being entirely appropriate 200 or 300 years ago. So I think the issue is it's not about communication of science, it's about changing fundamental values.
Are there any other actors go to the question of the actors?
Yeah, I'm against all forms of weather modification and any kind of tampering with Mother Nature. I believe if we ceased all current weather modification activities, I believe that this would be the solution to solve the climate change problem. So what I'm saying is I believe climate change has been caused by these current programs. It's a problem that's been created so that solutions can be presented. But however, if a global consensus were to be met and a large percentage of the planet were to agree on weather modification and putting it into the hands of the military, how could you trust a military that went into Iraq on a lie of weapons of mass destruction, based on a lie of weapons of mass destruction, which led to the death of 1 million citizens? How could we possibly leave put the trust into these people's hands,
I'd actually just like to follow up a quick question back to you, because we're struggling to get action from a top-down perspective. Whatever it's from a bottom-up perspective, we're actually succeeding with local actions. It's just they haven't got together to create that global social contract, if you like. So what's your sense of the bottom-up movements that some people here are participants in? Is there a sense of the movements are growing quick enough to move to action, or quick enough to change political will? As I say, is there enough? I'm just saying, you're coming from an activist background,
okay,
which is some conversation we don't often have, obviously, with the military. And we're struggling to get top-down action quick enough on global change or on climate change or climate engineering. What is the sense from the activist movement? Is there hope that you're going to change enough people and enough quickly to take the necessary actions that you believe will prevent warming?
Well, I personally, for 4 years I've been trying to alert my fellow human beings to these crimes that are taking place with our weather. It's very hard to reach people. It's like science fiction. They think it's too far out to believe or to comprehend that this could be possibly going on. I think so. From an activist, being a voice in the wilderness, so to speak, where I'm from, it's very hard to reach people, and I can't see that I will wake enough people up enough on my own, but I see other people waking up around me and also understanding how real this is. We need public awareness. We need the media to start talking about this. We need to bring these discussions into the public forum, and not just behind closed doors. Like, this is the only way we're going to be able to alert the people about what's going on.
I think there was another comment on that. So.
the storyline that is accepted universally within the consensus of the various organisations involved. It seems to me that the government funds the military, therefore the government would be have authority to dictate what you should be doing. That's the way it works. And it's the same with the scientific community. Your funding comes from the government or from companies, corporations that are closely connected with the government. So clearly there is a government consensus that science should be looking for this, military should be doing this. If we look to the past, Australia is quite an interesting one. If we ran the models with Australia's data, we would find that in 1890 you had terrible heat waves. In the 1920s, 1930s, there were terrible heat waves that killed up to 2,000 people. And if you ran the data on Australia's climate alone, you would get different type of result in the climate modelling. So you would have to wonder whether or not CO2 was responsible for those particular warming periods. Now if we look to the past and governments and their effects on what should be done, President John F. Kennedy in 1961 addressed the United Nations Assembly on the 25th of September. And during his speech he mentioned that the outer space would not be used for weapons of mass destruction deployment. He also mentioned that all nations would work together to accurately predict the weather and eventually control the weather. This is in 1961. So we can see that somewhere in the governments of the past, at least, I mean, if we go back to 1964, the National Science Foundation, when they were talking about their budgets, they were actively pursuing various different weather modification techniques, and later in 1966 they presented a document for controlling the weather and the climate. So clearly there's been a long-term government initiative to learn how to control the climate. So the question would be, would this be enacted in secret, maybe slowly, a little bit at a time, so that it wouldn't get too much attention, covertly, and then at a later date we could start to look at the changes and say there's a climate problem, and then this really is all about creating a global governance, a one world system, which is what sustainable development will bring in. So clearly what I'm trying to indicate is that the governments are quite happy to pursue this climate change issue because this is the key to unlock the New World Order, which is what Mikhail Gorbachev said in 1996. And he is a member of the Club of Rome, and the Club of Rome is the funder of this, one of the sponsors of this conference.
I'm just going to leave that one, I think, as I'm not qualified to comment. I we just want to spend, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to go briefly to the worst case type of scenario. We now have a climate emergency. So the tipping points in the Earth system tip. We get to a stage where we have, and I think some people have talked about this as a difference between a 9 billion people world or a 1 billion people world. And being a historian, I've studied the classic Mayan collapse, the Black Death, the collapse of the Roman Empire. These are very messy, conflicted periods. So I'm going to ask the same question I asked for the first 2 futures. So this is the worst case future. Who thinks this is likely in the next 100 years? That gives me much cause for confidence. Do you think this is likely at all? Do we think we're ever going to get to a world that is so catastrophic that we have effectively a breakdown in global order? Yeah, there is a video about this. There's actually several movies out about this. But so apart from film directors, does anyone in this community think that we and perhaps it won't be a climate tipping point, it may be an economic or a social response to climate that gets us into that space?
I think it's not likely, but it's possible.
You asked if it's likely, and I didn't raise my hand, but I think it's possible that things like this could happen. Earlier in that 2 you had, you asked for global governance, and I didn't raise my hand because I think maybe something like the Major Emitters Forum, they could do something like that, which are not in any way legitimized by the world community, except for the power they have. So this is sort of a scenario that I think is possible.
So if I ask the question again, everyone has to be among scientists and be precise with my definitions of probability. Who thinks this might be possible in the next 100 years? Okay, so that's quite a bit more of the audience. What type of tipping point do you think would prompt a government, either unilaterally or acting in a cluster, to deploy sort of the silver bullet, if you like? So it's hard to people sort of imagine a world that might require this type of action, and ask someone to comment on what it might look like.
A couple of things that work together. So a rather quick rise in the sea level, which would put lots of people on the move because they have to leave small island states and Bangladesh, and then maybe the permafrost in the Arctic getting mushy and releasing all sorts of carbon, so things accelerate in the atmosphere. If that acts together, that might create the level of this destabilization that's needed.
I think that's possible. I think it's just as likely that whatever it is completely unrelated to climate change, and that it's some other issue that people maybe inaccurately associate with climate change, and that triggers some sort of crisis behaviour or emergency behaviour, or legitimises the title of emergency or crisis.
Any further comments on the dystopian future? Okay, I might hold it there as a good time. Thank the audience for their participation. Hopefully this is trying to do a slightly different approach. And again, just repeat the advert for those that are looking to run an ad hoc session on Friday. Please go and, if you're interested, contact the conference office in Rugby. So thank you.